Hello and welcome everyone. Today I want to show you how to craft high-end Spectre boots with 2 elevated modifiers, including the plus level mod. While it's sometimes possible to buy items with the elevated modifiers, or at least the influence modifier we want, plus one more for an op of dominance slam, very often the items in question aren't available or simply too expensive. Instead, we craft them from basic materials, meaning we start out with an Elder influenced pair of boots, either Sorcerer boots for energy shield builds, and either Titan Greaves or Armor Evasion two-tone boots for life builds. The first step is rolling the boots with alterations until you hit plus level raised Spectre gems. I'm going to abbreviate this process, right? But in general, this is going to take you around 200 alterations or so. The following steps are aimed at introducing a second influence modifier, so as soon as you hit one, you can skip ahead to the Orb of Dominance Slam. If your builds didn't roll a prefix, you can use an Orb of Augmentation, followed by using a Regal Orb and crafting a dummy prefix, like Life for example. Fill the remaining mods by using Exalted Orbs. If your item still doesn't have a second influence modifier after that, you have to craft suffixes can't be changed and use the Harvest Craft Reforged Lightning. Now in this case, we wouldn't have to do that, right? Because I just rolled a influence modifier on the last go. Let's say that didn't end up happening. So as I said, suffixes can't be changed, and then Reforge Lightning. This is guaranteed to give you an influenced modifier as long as the suffixes are filled. You can now use an Orb of Dominance to try to upgrade the plus level mod. In this case, it didn't work, so we'd have to start over again. If you successfully upgraded the plus level mod, you can move on to the second pair of boots with a different influence. The second influence modifier can be any non-Elder suffix. I personally went with this Warlord modifier because it helps with the Shaper, Elder, and Maven fight. To get the elevated mod, you have to follow the same steps as before. Sorry. That should be a crafted mod. To get the elevated modifier, you have to follow the same steps as before, the only difference being the Harvest Craft at the very end. The type of Reforge depends on the influence in question, so Fire for Shaper and Warlord, Lightning for Crusader, Chaos for Hunter, and Cold for Redeemer. Followed of course by an Orb of Dominance Slam. Once you've successfully upgraded both mods, you can combine the items by using an Awakener's Orb. This is a bit weird in Craft of Exile. In Path of Exile, you do this by clicking the item with the base you intend to keep last. And you would end up with an item that looks like this. The two elevated modifiers, and potentially an additional suffix and a number of prefixes. If you end up with 3 prefixes and are unhappy with the mods you have to remove one with an Orb of Annulment. So let's say you had an additional, I don't know, something like this, right? Then you would have to annul to remove one of them. If at any point in time, not just for this step, but the steps afterwards, you would, if you were to remove one of these 2 modifiers, you would have to start over again. If you ended up with a third suffix that you don't want, you would have to use an Orb of Annulment to remove it as well. Obviously, you can also remove one of your target modifiers, so keep in mind that when evaluating the modifier in question, right, whether you really want to remove it or not. If you didn't end up with a third suffix or successfully removed a shitty one and have at least one open prefix, you can now craft suffixes can't be changed and use a harvest reforge craft. The specific type once again depends on the influence of the second modifier. There are lots of reforge options that can potentially roll interesting modifiers. However, I can't cover all of them due to the sheer number of possibilities. Instead, I recommend the following list of reforge options that deterministically introduce resistance modifiers. Chaos for Shaper, Cold of Fire for Crusader, any element for Hunter, Cold for Warlord, and Fire for Redeemer. The recommendation for Shaper is obviously only useful for non-CI builds because it would introduce chaos resistance, so keep that in mind. While this allows you to deterministically introduce a specific mod, you have little control over the tiers, so don't expect perfect rolls every time. For example, in this case, we ended up with a tier 4 cold resistance modifier. If this isn't good enough for you, you would have to repeat the last step, so remove it with an orb of annulment. As I mentioned before, right, the likelihood of bricking your item this way is relatively high, so I would recommend to keep your expectations to be level. Once the suffixes are in order, you can craft suffixes can't be changed once again, and use a Veil Chaos Orb. You should craft mana and life regen as a block mod before unveiling to maximize your chances of getting a decent movement speed modifier. If you didn't get a good movement speed mod or got an additional prefix, you would have to repeat the last step. If you filled your prefixes with unwanted mods, you have to annul one of them, which can once again remove one of the 2 elevated mods, throwing it back a step or entirely bricking your item. After unveiling, you want to introduce another block mod, mana for energy shield boots, and armor and evasion for everything else. After that, you want to Exalt Slam for a new modifier. For energy shield builds, we're looking for either percentage or flat energy shield. And in rare circumstances, you can keep a life mod like this for certain types of hybrid builds. If you're not happy with what you just, with the prefix you ended up with, you have to repeat the last step. Unveiling once again, crafting the block mod, and then slamming another Exalt Orb. And you do this until you end up with a modifier that you consider good enough to keep. The hybrid mod perf is pretty terrible. I would not recommend actually keeping this one, right? But percentage-based modifiers, well, ones with an appropriate tier, at least, are somewhat okayish. In this case, we rolled a pretty terrible flat energy shield mod, but if you don't have a lot of currency, then this might be the only thing you can really afford, right? Because with every repetition, obviously the cost increases and the likelihood of bricking your item increases as well. You would finish the item by crafting the other type of energy shield mod. So if you hit a flat ES mod, you would craft a percentage-based and vice versa. For life-based builds, you would do pretty much the exact same. Once again, if you end up with a suffix you don't want, you have to try to remove it. Chance of breaking your items this way is always high, but that's just what it is. So we once again reforge cold because it's a warlord item, right? Actually got lucky here, hit tier 1 cold resistance. The next steps are pretty much the exact same, right? You would craft suffixes can't be changed. Use a Veiled Chaos Orb. We got this Elder mod, which is pretty much useless, so we can just go ahead and repeat this step. Now, after unveiling, there is something interesting about life-based or boots for life-based builds that isn't really an option for energy shield-based builds. And that is, instead of crafting a block mod, you just craft the highest tier of life mod and then just slam for one more modifier and just call it quits. Now, this once again can introduce modifiers that are completely useless, like this one, And you might want to actually repeat the last step. In this case, you have an even better incentive because you also rolled this movement speed modifier that really isn't the craziest, right? Like, movement speed and onslaught doesn't do that much for most minion builds. So yeah, block mod, unveil, right? Same questionable movement speed mod, but you know, for the sake of it. And in this case, we rolled a decent armor and evasion modifier, and then we could call it quits here. This method is cheaper than crafting a block mod and trying to slam exalted orbs for the life mod. The difference is that this way you can never get a high tier life mod. Right? The crafted modifier here is essentially the equivalent of a tier 3 mod. So if you are looking for a tier 2 or tier 1 life mod, you couldn't use this. Instead, you would have to craft a block mod after unveiling, which in this case is armor and evasion, and then slam for the life mod. Right? Obviously, the likelihood of this giving you tier 1 or even just tier 2 life is relatively low. So in terms of cost effectiveness, the other method, right, the one that just went with the max life mod and just slammed for one additional modifier is obviously more cost effective. Which method you choose is up to you, depends on your build, depends on how much currency you want to spend. Same is true for the other type of influence, and by that the modifier you want to introduce, right? It doesn't have to be this mod, can be any suffix. Mixing suffixes and prefixes is obviously not a thing with this type of crafting method, because we really have to finish the suffixes before we can move on to the prefixes, right? But in general, this is something you can use. The amount of potential, well, suffixes, influence suffixes is relatively high on boots. So you can mix and match for the most part, as long as the second influence suffix you are introducing is not an elder suffix, right? Because obviously it doesn't work with Awakener's Orbs. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments. I try to get to them as soon as I can. If you want to support my work, connect with me and my community, you can check out my socials, including Twitch, Discord, and Patreon on my channel page, or in the description of this video. Hope you liked it. Until next time.